Welcome back. Today, we're looking at a really compelling piece, a documentary outline on the Goraba Cow Dung Throwing Festival in India. It covers the ritual itself, its meaning, but also the pretty intense online harassment the filmmaker faced afterward.
Yeah, this one definitely has impact. You've got this deep cultural immersion, but then this whole second layer about the fallout, the doxing, high-stakes stuff. But to really make it land, I think we need to look closely at the structure, especially how it handles that tension between, let's say, the sacredness and the shock factor.
Right, because the notes mention it's their holiest tradition, the god Virawada Swami being born from cow dung, the belief it cures disease. But then the description uses words like sinking, disgusting, even fecal nirvana. Is that sensationalism getting in the way?
I think it is, yeah. To effectively preempt those accusations of bias, maybe even racism, the material really has to foreground the spiritual significance. It can't just be presented as some unusual tradition.
Okay.
The weakness, as I see it, is structural. The narrative kind of buries the deep religious reasons under all the sensational descriptions and the physical shock. And that risks letting viewers just see it as absurd.
Which, based on the submission, seems to be exactly what fueled that aggressive backlash you mentioned, the doxing, the threats.
Exactly. So the shock value, while maybe grabbing attention initially, it actually leaves the piece vulnerable.
So how do you adjust that? I mean, you don't want to lose the visceral reality of being there, right? That physical experience is part of the story.
No, absolutely not. The suggestion isn't to sanitize it, but to integrate the sacred context much earlier and more consistently, visually and thematically. Really link that physical immersion directly to the why, the healing, the blessing, the cleansing as the villagers understand it.
Okay, so pair the visceral stuff with the spiritual meaning almost immediately. Got it. Can you give a couple of concrete examples of how that might work, like in the edit?
Sure. So take that moment with the local who claims eating cow dung prevents cancer. That's obviously a very jarring claim for many viewers.
Right.
Immediately after that, you need to bring in the narration that reinforces the divine origin story, the Beshwara idol being found in cow dung. That immediately anchors the shock in its spiritual context. It provides the why.
Ah, I see. So shock, then immediate context.
Precisely. Or another one, those visuals of the huge piles of cow dung, the ones that took 5 or 6 months to collect, instead of just framing them as ammunition for this dung fight, use that visual to symbolize months of devotion and preparation. It reframes the effort completely.
That's a good shift.
And one more in the final sequence, where the creator talks about feeling physically disgusted, sort of defeated by the experience initially. Explicitly contrast that feeling with what the men are seeking. You could say something like, well, I felt physically overwhelmed. For these men, this was a sacred cleansing, a path to blessings. It juxtaposes the external reaction with the internal, spiritual goal.
Okay, yeah, that makes the creator's physical reaction almost the measure of the local's faith in a way. Much stronger than just, wow, this is weird.
Exactly. It builds a much better defense against those accusations.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's move to the next big challenge then. This is where the narrative kind of pivots quite sharply, right? From the festival itself to the filmmaker's personal safety, the harassment, the doxing. The notes mention really awful messages like, I want to fuck your sister, death threats, and this feeling the creator had of being defeated before deciding to release the film anyway.
Right. And that shift, moving from observer to essentially the subject of international online harassment, it needs a clearer thematic bridge. It needs to feel connected, not just tacked on, to really maximize its impact as a meta-narrative.
Okay, so what's the weakness currently? It just feels abrupt?
Yeah, the weakness is that the sudden insertion of the doxing and the personal threats, it kind of interrupts the flow. It risks pulling focus away from the cultural documentation and turning it into more of a personal victim story.
Which could dilute the original journalistic purpose.
Potentially, yes. It risks making the creator the main story rather than the festival and the cultural context, including the reaction to documenting it.
So the personal danger is obviously a huge part of the story. Very compelling. But it needs to serve the larger narrative, not take it over. How do we make sure that sequence strengthens the cultural reporting instead of overshadowing?
Well, the suggestion here is to frame the harassment and doxing not just as a personal attack, although it certainly felt that way, I'm sure, but frame it narratively as an extension of the cultural conflict itself.
Ah.
It's like a modern digital manifestation of that deep desire within the community, or at least among some connected to it, to protect what they see as their holiest tradition from outside eyes, especially potentially critical ones.
So the threats become evidence of the sensitivity of the subject matter itself.
Exactly. It makes the creator's experience almost a necessary part of documenting something this charged. It's not an interruption. It's part of the story of trying to tell the specific story.
Okay, I think I get that framing. How would that look in practice? How do you weave it in more smoothly?
Well, for example, when you introduce the online hate, the tens of thousands of Indian nationalists explicitly connect their anger back to the villagers' stated desire to protect the festival. You mentioned the goal was to stop content intended to dehumanize.
Right.
So you explicitly link the online mob to that protective impulse. It contextualizes the threats. It's not random internet rage. It's a targeted reaction rooted in the cultural sensitivity you've already established.
Makes sense.
And then, you mentioned in the notes there was a mainstream French news reporter also there at the temple.
Yeah.
Leverage that. Use that observation to highlight the perceived double standard. Something like, my documentation was labeled a racist attack, yet similar footage captured by mainstream European news was simply journalism. That really sharpens the conflict. It becomes about who gets to tell the story and how it's framed.
And that final decision then, to release the video despite everything, that line, I will never stop fighting for the truth, that becomes the climax of this meta-narrative.
Precisely. It transforms the narrative arc. The creator isn't just a victim who felt defeated. They become the protagonist who stands up for journalistic principle, reinforcing the core purpose, documenting reality, no matter how contested it is.
Yeah, that gives that whole section real backbone. Okay, let's talk about the third area. This is where the piece moves from documenting the festival towards broader cultural commentary. The notes mention it uses the festival to talk about cultural differences, assimilation, hygiene, even bringing in things like claims about beach pooping, immigration, media bias that seem a bit outside the immediate scope of Gumatapura.
Right. And look, transitioning from a specific event to broader commentary is a valid goal. But to do it effectively, especially with something this sensitive, the piece needs to anchor those big macro claims in verifiable internal contradictions that you've actually observed and documented within the village itself.
Okay, so the weakness is jumping too far afield.
The weakness is relying on generalized, sometimes anecdotal claims from outside the core reporting. Things like other crime reports or broad statements about immigration elsewhere. That actually dilutes the power of the evidence you gathered on the ground in Gumatapura. Your strongest material is right there.
So don't bring in external debates if the core story itself contains enough contradiction or complexity to make the point about cultural difference.
Exactly. Why reach for weaker external examples when you have potent-specific ones right in front of you? The suggestion is to anchor any commentary on cultural differences squarely in the contradictory statements, the specific rules, the observable tensions within the village narrative. Use the micro to illustrate the macro, not the other way around.
That feels much tighter, much more defensible. Okay, so sticking with Gumatapura, what kind of internal contradictions could really fuel that commentary effectively?
Well, you've got a perfect example right in the notes. Highlight that specific conflict of belief. One local claims eating dung is scientifically proven to cure cancer.
Right.
That's a much sharper point. Yeah.
And another concrete example, focus on that specific religious rule you mentioned. The Lord said, "You men come and celebrate," which explicitly forbids women from participating. Use that specific, verifiable rule from within this tradition to discuss how ancient religious dictates can shape modern gender roles within a community. That's far more powerful and grounded than making vague generalizations about women's rights in India or elsewhere based on external perception. Okay, grounding the commentary in the specific internal details makes it much stronger, less open to accusations of generalization. Got it.
It makes the commentary unassailable because it flows directly from your own reporting.
This has been incredibly helpful. So, to recap the main strategies we discussed, first, really reorient the start of the narrative. Prioritize that sacred context early and consistently to counter potential accusations of dehumanization or just focusing on shock value.
Right. Context first, then the visceral experience makes sense within that context.
Second, use the personal harassment story not as an interruption but as a structural bridge. Frame it as a direct consequence, a modern manifestation of the cultural conflict inherent in documenting this tradition. That creates a really compelling meta-narrative about the cost and importance of truth-telling.
Exactly. It becomes integral, not adjacent.
And third, when moving to broader commentary, anchor everything firmly in the specific, verifiable contradictions and rules observed within the village itself. Use the internal evidence, like the conflicting beliefs about Dung or the specific rules about participation, rather than relying on external generalizations.
That keeps it focused, powerful, and journalistically sound.
Excellent. These feel like very actionable ways to elevate what's already very powerful material.
Absolutely. It's strong stuff. These adjustments, I think, will really help it reach its full potential and stand up to the scrutiny it's likely, and perhaps already has, faced. We're definitely looking forward to seeing how it develops. Feel free to send the revised material back our way for another look when you're ready.